Hello and welcome back, and today I want to compare two 6-bay NAS systems, one from Synology and the other from QNAP. Before we go any further though, I should highlight, if I'm very quiet you can just hear a hiss in the background. That is two rack mount devices just in the corner there going absolutely bananas. And as much as I've tried to limit a lot of that sound leaking over here, it's becoming very, very difficult. So I do apologise for that background noise there throughout this video. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about it, and those systems are going to be building their respective RAIDs for about 4 days all told. So it's really hard to get around. But onto the matter at hand. This is the brand new, recently released DS1621 Plus. It is the new 6-bay from Synology that features a bunch of upgrades over its predecessor and a few, brand unique systems built into it. And we are comparing this NAS against the now something like 4 months old TS653D from QNAP. Now, although they're both 6-bay NASs and they're both part of the featured flagship series from both brands, it's worth highlighting that they've gone a very different direction in terms of hardware architecture. They both run their own respective software platforms to a remarkably high degree and can be upgraded in a number of ways, but there is no avoiding it that the way these two have been built and the priority of the hardware inside in mind is very, very different. And not only are their price points very different as well, but ultimately their end user that will make the most of them differs too. So what we're going to look at today, if you're someone who's looking to buy a 6-bay prosumer or small medium business NAS from either one of these two brands that pretty much dominate the network attached storage field, then chances are these two right now in very late 2020 are the ones that are on your radar. Now, the DS1621 Plus arrives at about 750 to 800 quid, shopping around wherever you go from there, including tax and local delivery and stuff like that, not including the drives, but again, about 750 to 800 pounds. The QNAP, on the other hand, arrives at about 550 to 600 pounds. So a very noticeable difference in price between these two 6-bay NASs, which at a casual glance have a very, very similar architecture. But once you dig a little deeper into the hardware, huge differences between them become apparent, which should hopefully help you decide which one's best for you. But before we go any further, let's talk about what they can both do. What have they got in common? And ultimately, whether you buy each one of these, what are you guaranteed to get? Well, you're going to be getting a combined hardware and software solution. That is a data storage system that arrives with all the hardware you need to back up your data, apart from hard drives and SSD, of course. But on top of that, also arrives with a fully featured enterprise-grade software platform with loads of client apps, mobile apps, and access on a myriad of different browser platforms anywhere in the world or on your local network very, very easily, all included in that price. You've got applications there for multimedia, be it for photos, music, and video. You've got AI-powered photo recognition as well. In terms of backing up, you have multi-platform, multi-tiered applications in Hyper Backup and Hybrid Backup Sync 3 that allow you to create a very tailored and very unique backup strategy across multiple platforms, from cloud to USB, from NAS to NAS, whichever best suits your needs. So both arrive with great file management tools in File Station, Synology Drive, QNAP, and a lot of their QSync applications as well. They both arrive with resource monitoring and access tools in DSM 6.2 and 7. They have great tools for the CMS system, as well as Active Insight and more coming in DSM 7 later on. From QNAP, you have got a great resource monitor there and huge overviews of single and multiple QNAP systems in a home or business environment for backing up and monitoring and updating them and basically controlling them with relative ease. They both arrive with support of end users in business sectors with email clients, VPN clients built in there, surveillance clients in Surveillance Station and QVR Pro with multiple camera licenses included. They both arrive with VM support with Synology Virtual Machine Manager and Virtualization Station. They both arrive with huge support of virtual machine backups with Hypervisor and Active Backup Suite from Synology, now covering more and more platforms. And again, all of this included in the price. they both arrive with a huge amount of support of their own apps and third-party apps as well, and they both arrive with 3 years of manufacturer's warranty. So again, whichever one you go for, you do have a very competent platform there to play with. But as you dig a little deeper into the hardware, the differences between them become very, very apparent. So first thing, let's talk about design. They've both gone very different directions in terms of design. Synology and this 6-bay chassis here, we have seen before in 2 or 3 different variants prior to this one's release. It's got the 6 bays there on the front. Each one of those bays, of course, has got a click and load tray there inside, spring loaded. It's lockable there on the front, and there's screw holes to 2.5-inch drives as well, and drives are installed without a screwdriver. This one, the QNAP here, the DS1621, it doesn't have the same kind of trays. It's got this front mounted panel here, which is lockable. It's unlocked at the moment, but if you unlock it, this panel comes off. And inside there, we have got our 6 bays of storage. There's even an LCD panel there at the top as well to give real-time information about the device. And inside, if we pull a drive bay, again, plastic click and load drives. You can install them there by removing the clips. There's 2.5-inch in there, but these trays aren't lockable. That is incredibly small fry in the grand scheme of things, but that might be an area of contention for you. Now, both of them have got LEDs based on the front of the device that indicate the system when it's in operation. The QNAP has got all 6 of those LEDs there on the front for each of the drives, and there's one for network access and system activity, as well as a USB port there on the front and one touch copy button. The Synology, on the other hand, has got LEDs at each of the individual drives on the bottom there, and LEDs there at the top for the network ports and system status too. And there's a small USB 3 port there on the bottom as well, but no one-touch copy button. And again, it's a metal chassis from Synology in this 6-bay series. It's quite industrial as well, and it's metal, as you can hear. The couple of fans there on the rear and all the network ports that we're going to talk about later on. In the case of the QNAP, it is a plastic chassis, and we've got the 2 fans there on the rear, but you may already have noticed between them that the QNAP is noticeably smaller. Sits there between the 2 of them, and if we go to the depth of the devices, they're pretty similar, but ultimately the 2 of them are very largely the same depth, but the difference in terms of width is very, very noticeable between them. Now, I've got to say, I can't really rate them beyond my own opinion about design. I will argue that metal chassis will produce more hums and whirs and vibration whilst in utilisation, but at the same time, that metal does act as increased heat dissipation and therefore assists cooling to a degree whilst the system is being utilised, which for a lot of business users with constant access, you're going to see the benefits of. On top of that, the Synology does have those ventilated logos there on the side, which act as dust filters and also assist the active cooling of those rear fans to provide passive airflow over the drives and over the internal PCBs. In the case of the QNAP, got to say it's the quieter of the 2 by a noticeable degree, and its more compact nature may be quite desirable to a number of you out there, particularly those prosumer home users. And again, it does not include small business users who want a far more compact, discrete device that can be hidden away. It doesn't have the fancy side panels there for ventilation. It has the vents there, but it doesn't have the logo branded ones, but there's lots of ventilation there on the base of the device. Overall, between the 2 of them, I personally think the design of the Synology looks nicer. I think they've done a little bit more work in terms of their aesthetic design, but it's also a lot more rugged, a lot more hardcore in terms of its metal nature and its weight. So that's not really for everyone, but it's got to be said, if I have one of these on my desk, if I'm going to be working in relative close proximity to it, my eyes are slightly more drawn to the Synology chassis for me personally. Now, in terms of hardware, that's where things get real interesting between them, because the hardware on both of them, again, as I mentioned at the top of the video, is relatively similar at a glance. They both feature 64-bit x86 architecture processors in quad core, both of which surpassing 2 GHz, and they both arrive with 4 GB or 4 GB of DDR4 memory overall. So On the face of it, you think, oh, well, relatively similar CPU and memory then, isn't it? And it's just not the case. Between the two of them, the CPUs are, there's an AMD Ryzen based inside the 1621, and that's the V1500B. And the first time we've seen a Ryzen CPU inside a Synology NAS, and that memory of 4 gig can be upgraded up to 32 gig, and that memory inside is DDR4, but it's also ECC, error code correction memory inside. So again, higher quality memory overall. In the case of the QNAP, it arrives with the J4125, a Celeron-based processor from Intel, and that processor is probably the higher frequency of the two, with 2.2 gigahertz per core on the Synology and 2.0 gigahertz on the QNAP that can be burst up to 2.7. The 4 gig inside this is not ECC, and it can be upgraded to 8 gig. So overall, it has to be said, in terms of memory, the Synology does win, but it's very hard to compare these CPUs very precisely in the world of NAS without knowing how the end user wants to use their data. So case in point, this CPU in the QNAP has got embedded graphics, UHD 600 graphics, which means it has a dedicated component in its main CPU controller that will handle graphics, and it means the CPU will not have to use raw power to handle visual data, which can be very, very demanding, and ultimately will use more system resources overall. The CPU inside the Synology does not feature embedded GPU inside, so it will use more power to do the average task. And when we did our Plex media server testing, it has to be said that in terms of Plex, the QNAP did certainly win that because of that extra graphical oomph behind it. And that went for native transcoding apps, not just Plex media server. In 4K transcoding, the QNAP won, largely because this CPU is not designed for 4K handling of that nature, both natively and via Plex media server. Now, we've still got the surveillance comparison to do, but I've compared these two brands in terms of surveillance before, and I've got to say, a more graphically enabled CPU goes a long way. That said, the Ryzen inside this is powerful enough to handle surveillance station, because that video I have done, and it has left me very, very impressed. In terms of virtualization for VM deployment, it's going to be very hard to argue with 32 gig maximum memory inside this device. They're both quad cores, and to a degree you are going to have to, assign some of that CPU power to individual VMs, so there is a glass ceiling there. But in terms of overall memory availability, it's real tough to argue with a 32 gig max DDR4 memory standard on this device. Now, one other feature about internal hardware, before we get onto the external hardware that's worth touching on, is to do with this Synology. It also arrives with two NVMe M2 SSD cache bays inside, 2280 length in design, and it allows the system to improve the internal performance by including those two NVMe SSDs to cache the data in conjunction with the overall storage array in that RAID. The QNAP doesn't have that facility by default, and you do have to get a PCIe upgrade card to take advantage of that. And you can still use SATA drives, but you didn't get a 6-bay to give up some of the bays to caching. So that extra little feature does need to be highlighted on the Synology. That said, we are still talking about something that is going to require an additional purchase of NVMEs, and secondly, we are talking about NVMEs that can only be used for caching. You can't use them for raw storage, which I know bums a number of you guys out when you hear about the architecture of these devices. Now, if we flip them around, let me have a look at the rear of these, we can talk a little bit more about ports and connections, because that's another area where Synology and QNAP have gone very different ways. They've both got the rear active cooling fans here that will, increase or decrease based on the internal temperatures of the device to maintain efficiency, but a lot of the differences are very, very apparent early doors. First and foremost, we have 4 LAN ports here on the Synology that, with support of link aggregation, means that each one with 1 gigabit Ethernet can be combined into 4 gigabit Ethernet, 4 GBE, or around 440 megabytes per second in the right storage environment. The QNAP, on the other hand, only has 2 LAN ports, but both of those are 2.5 GBE, leading to a combination with link aggregation of 5 gigabit Ethernet, or potential maximum of 550 megs. So that's a very hard one to compare. There are 2 which result in increased bandwidth, and 4 here that result in a more widespread but ultimately smaller bandwidth. Then of course you've got more distinctive connections between both of these brands, which they've always featured on their previous generation. So for example, although we see USB ports on both of them, it's worth highlighting that the Synology has 3 USB 3 ports and the QNAP has 2 USB 3 ports and 3 USB 2 ports, because a lot of the USB connections on the QNAP are used for more than just storage. They're utilized for peripheral devices, KVM situations, keyboard, video, mouse, and other adapters such as the 5GB adapter to USB from QNAP. So again, both companies have gone very different ways on that. On the Synology, we see 2 eSATA ports that allow us to attach 2 5-bay expansions and ultimately turn our 6-bay NAS into a potential 16-bay storage system across those 3 different chassis. QNAP, on the other hand, utilize USB for these expansion devices, predominantly on their selection of expansion devices, of which they have a lot more expansions available in 2, 4, 6, 8, 12 and bigger expansion devices across their whole range, some of which connecting via USB, some of which utilizing PCIe and proprietary external SAS connections. Now, we talk about external, let's talk about PCIe. A number of you may have noticed I've got the backplane removed from this. There is normally a cover on that, but this I've been utilizing for 10GBE and I just removed it for this video and I'm putting it back. So normally that has a cover, but both of these systems have PCIe upgrade slots, and that allows you to increase network interface ports, to add supported PCIe cards from their own brand, as well as companies like Mellanox and Intel. But it's worth highlighting that because of the CPU and PCIe lanes featured in both of them, the support of those services and connections inside do wildly differ. In the case of the QNAP, it's a PCIe Gen 2 x 2 slot. On the case of the Synology, on the other hand, this device arrives with a PCIe Gen 3 x 8 slot. That is a large disparity between these two devices, with this port here arriving with a smaller bandwidth connection between the card and the internal chipset overall, compared with the one on the Synology. The Synology cards, generally in their entire range, on most of the modern cards anyway, do not arrive with any PCIe support less than PCIe Gen 3 x 4 or Gen 3 x 8. The majority of the cards from QNAP range all the way down as low as PCIe Gen 2 x 2 and up to 3 x 8 as well. There are more cards and upgrade options from QNAP in their range, from Wi-Fi 6 to increased network cards to NVMe and M2 cache cards and live storage cards and combo cards. There is lots of options possible. So there are more PCIe upgrades on the QNAP, but it's worth highlighting that the few that are from Synology are almost all Synology own brand and faster in their overall bandwidth connection between the card and the system. So you can see both brands have very different priorities in terms of their hardware. Another one we should touch on is the fact that the QNAP arrives with an HDMI out. This system can be connected to a visual source, an HDMI monitor, as well as having a keyboard, a mouse, or wireless Bluetooth dongle or wireless connection, and ultimately create a standalone interface that you can utilize for multimedia, for surveillance, to have a local virtual machine, to use Linux, Ubuntu VMs. There's a huge amount of potential of that HDMI port brings to the table, again, for home and business users alike, and it's something that Synology, for the most part, has never really embraced beyond surveillance systems that require that standalone feature. It's something that's more widely available from QNAP across their systems, and a lot of that is to do with that port. So in terms of hardware, you can't really pick between them and say one's the winner more than the other. It's about you, the end user. If you are a multimedia user, then certainly the QNAP hardware wins overall in terms of the CPU, the coverage of 4K, and the HDMI out. For me, flat out win it. If you are a business user looking at file transmission speeds, the Synology is probably the one for you because of that ECC memory and that more file accessible CPU overall. For surveillance, I'm going to call it a flat out tie, because the Synology software for me is the better by a pinch overall, with access to the cameras via the web browser, full graphical user interface control, and great localized add-on applications like smart home apps as well. But I would argue that the QNAP platform is still very, very close with QVR Pro, with 8 camera licenses currently included versus just 2 on the Synology. And on the QNAP, you've got that standalone surveillance option. You've got the ability to add web cameras via USB and mobile cameras. The ability to create a much more customized surveillance system cannot be ignored. Ultimately, between them, it comes down to you and being what kind of user you are, which leads us very neatly into the software side of things. Now, in terms of software, as mentioned, they both arrive with that great graphical user interface and NAS software with loads and loads of apps as well. But what I would argue, as I say in these videos all the time, the Synology platform is the more user-friendly of the two, but it also feels the more restrictive. A lot of the applications you use run very well, very fluidly, and just they look beautiful on the Synology, but it has to be said, they do that by limiting a lot of the customization options to you, generally a lot of the time, and you kind of have to do things the app's way, because the app has been tweaked and designed to be as efficient and fast and cached and responsive as possible, but it does that by not letting you deviate from that path to do things your own way. A lot of the apps will tell you your data has to live here in order to make the most of this app. You can't have it anywhere else, just here in this directory on this part of the system. And a number of users don't want to do that. So as good as the software is, and I cannot stress enough how good the DSM software is, a lot of you out there that are more IT literate, those of you that are more Android and Windows user based, PC gamer based people are going to enjoy the QNAP way of things a little bit more. It's a lot more informative. Sometimes it can be a little bit intimidating as well with the amount of information thrown at you, but it's far more customizable, and it will configure its directories, its indexing, the way it works around your setup, not the other way around. Unfortunately, it means to be so open-ended, to have apps that are tailored to the way you work, and to have a hardware architecture that has to support 8 or 9 different ways of doing things. It means that no one way is ever going to outperform the one way of the Synology. You have got a far more diverse tool here, but you have a far more centered and performanced tool here. It's like comparing console gaming and PC gaming. This is configurable. This is a steady, flat system that will give you exactly what it promises, but no more. So in terms of software, we can look at standout applications. They both have AI supported applications in QMaggie and Synology Moments, soon to be Synology Photos. They've got Photo Station, Video Station, Music Station, download applications as well. We've talked about a bunch of backup and surveillance and VM tools. I would say in between the two of them, in terms of virtualization, QNAP still win it for me. Their virtualization station tool for me just brings a little bit more to the party. Synology have improved things wildly in their Synology Virtual Machine Manager and support of VMware and Hyper-V with backups as well, and bringing all of that backup architecture into the fold, along with Synology Drive, of course, that one portal access point that also acts as a great file streaming and localized backup system where you can pin files intelligently. Loads of stuff going on. Haven't even touched on Synology Office with chat and calendar and mail and all of these great applications from Synology, all first party, all serving to provide all the features and functionality as alternatives to Google Drive, alternatives to Office 365, alternatives to Skype and WhatsApp. They have their own apps and they prioritize their own apps too. The QNAP, on the other hand, although it has lots of applications, some real great ones too, a lot of those last 2 or 3 apps I mentioned, they don't have. They don't have their own Office app, but they do have the plugin and add-on for Office. You can open Office docs with Office, you know, DocX, Excel, that sort of thing, within the NAS using the interface that you're familiar with. Support of Skype on this device is great as well. Support of a lot of cloud platforms with their own dedicated apps are still available on this. And of course, the dedicated HDMI output tool, hybrid desk station is still very, very interesting indeed. So ultimately, it comes to that software. I think if you're a Mac user, if you're a console gamer, if you're someone that wants something to just shut up and do the job, the Synology is going to appeal to you in terms of software. But if you like things more customizable, you like things bespoke, you want things to be tinkered in a certain way, and you want to be able to deep dive into your hardware and your data and configure things the best way for you, you're going to find more luck in the QNAP. It's got a little bit more of a steeper learning curve, but ultimately can be more rewarding in that way. It takes a bit more time, takes a little bit more education long term, but it pays off. And that's the thing about these two devices. You do pay more for this Synology, but you are paying for saving time. You are paying to not have to learn about stuff yourself. You are ultimately paying for peace of mind. The QNAP, on the other hand, it's not that it's cheaper, that's not the right word. It's that the hardware architecture that it has is more open-ended to you, the end user, and it makes you be able to choose the way you want to go forward with your system. And ultimately, for me, that's why this system is more for PC gamers, it's more for the IT literate, and it's more for Android and Windows users overall. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. There's not much more I haven't touched on this. There's of course Synology Hybrid RAID, a great system of fluid RAID that's just not available on the QNAP, and both of them can have their warranties expanded to 5 years, but they both arrive with 3 years overall. There's so much more about these platforms that you need to learn, and subscribing to this channel will help you do it. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you did, click like. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. And do visit the links in the description to both span.com and, of course, NAS Compares, where this guide goes into more detail. I will see you next time.